Okay, I think we're gonna start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for everyone to join us. This is the last talk this year for Banbei. Today, we're deeply honored to have Judy Ikels, the author of the book, Death in Wartime China, A Daughter's Discovery. So she's gonna tell us about her birth father, Second Lieutenant William Wallace Jr. He was a Flying Tiger pilot who fought the Japanese invasion and sacrificed his life in China during the World War II. Judy is also going to tell us her story of discovering the history of her father and her trip to China. So I would also like to thank two special guests and the two Banbei members today. So one of them is standing here. Her name is Yang Jialing. She's the one initiated the project that made everything happen. And we have another special guest, but she's not here today. Her name is Marilyn Wang Stern. She helped greatly during the preparation, but she could not attend the seminar today because there's a conflict of schedule. So the two Banbei members I'd like to thank, one is Zhang Meng. She was the one that made the connection to connect the Jialing to Banbei. And the other member who's taking a picture over there is Gary. Yeah, Gary, he's the one, he also did a lot of work preparing the talk, and he also interviewed Judy, and he wrote an article about the interview. So yesterday, actually Friday, last Friday, November 11th, so that was the Veterans Day. Judy specifically requested to have her talk this weekend because of the Veterans Day last Friday. War is not just a victory or a loss, but about individual lives. So we hope today's Judy's talk can give us another chance to think about the history, the sacrifice, the war, and the peace. And also we like to pay our tribute to the American heroes who sacrificed their life in the fight the Japanese invasion along the side of the Chinese people. So, okay, now I just give the floor to Jialing. Yeah.
Thank you, Roma. 大家好，欢迎大家来参加这个讲座。Banbei的社长陆明，他让我给 Judy 今天的演讲人 Judy 做个介绍。他告诉我要用，因为是英文，今天是英文的讲座，所以这个介绍也就用英文讲一下。Okay, now I'm going to talk in English.
Either way.
I only got to know Judy a few months ago when we were attending an event in Deco Bacon House in DC. That's a historical house. It's the seat of the Organization for American Professional Foreign Service Officers. 美国外交官的俱乐部，它经常举办好多活动和会议。We happen to be seated at the same table for lunch. During our conversation, Judy pulled out a few sheets of paper. They were the design of a book cover, and one with Chinese characters. She told me she was writing a book about her birth father, the father she has never seen, who died in China in Yunnan in the Second World War. And she told me he is a Flying Tiger pilot. I was very intrigued and asked her the questions and wanted to know more. In China, most people, especially those of our age, know about Flying Tigers. No matter how the political and the climate and the rhetoric shifted, the Flying Tigers have always been the good guys, and they are the heroes in Chinese people's mind. T4 Seoul 半飞的老社长陈刚，他在he interviewed Judy before this book talk, and in his interview notes he said, the heroic American pilots came all the way to China and waged an air war against the Japan's invasion. It was like a beacon of hope for the wartime Chinese people. When they look up to the sky and see the American planes flying over, they feel the hope. And it is very true, because China desperately needed the support in the sky to fend off the Japanese bombing to Chongqing, Chengdu, Kunming, and the Burma Road. And my own father, he told me, and when they were studying in Xinanianda, and they were often bombed, and they have to look for cover and running from the class. And he stayed a short time in Chongqing, and the house he stayed was completely flattened by a Japanese bomb, and he lost everything that time he owned. So Chinese people really need Americans' help. But Judy herself, in the talk, and I learned Judy herself, she did not know enough about the war in China and the Pacific when she was growing up in Texas. She knew her father went to the war and died in China, but did not know how he died and the full story about flying tigers and the China-Burma theater of the war. So as the titles of the book suggests, the book has two parts of the story. One part is about her father, and the other part is about how she discovered her father after 70 years. It is a very important, emotional journey for her to finally get to know her birth father this way and to find how he died. But the more intriguing and the amazing story is how in his death, he was treated by the Chinese mountain people with such kindness, and after they found him on that fateful day in 1944. When the book was published, that book, and I got one from Amazon, after I read it, I found I was more emotionally related to Judy, because the path of our fathers somehow almost crossed. Both of our fathers crossed the hump in 1944 in opposite directions, though for the same purpose. Hump 可能大家都知道是驼峰，就在喜马拉雅山上面，印度和中国中间。And her father, at 25 years of age, flew from US to China, to India and then China, ready to fight for China. And my father, at 26, my sister is here today too, shortly after he graduated from Xinanianda, and he flew also over the Tuofeng from China to India and America, sponsored by the US and Chinese government, to learn how to make the better plane, fighter plane, so China can win the war. So the two young uniformed men, they were comrades for the same cause, even though they had never met. The US force was very new in the early 40s. Their attrition rate was very high. Many died in the flight, and more died in training and accidents. Still, supporting China was important on the Allies' agenda. General Chenault, Chen Nade Jiangjun, enlisted volunteer pilots and the US Air Force support teams to China to fight. They trained Chinese pilots and technical personnel in China and in the United States. Like the book said, this China-US collaboration should never be forgotten. Those who died for this just cause, like Judy's father, to help, her father died to help China, but at the same time to save several of his crew members, they all survived. They should be remembered forever by people from both sides. China's human sacrifice in the war was enormous. It was highest in the World War II, except Russia. But at the same time, China could not have won the war, won the anti-Japanese war without US support. Now about Judy, our speaker. Judy grew up in Texas. She grew up there, and she was born 5 months after her father sacrificed his life in China. She graduated from University of Texas in Austin, and she studied, majored in English and Spanish. She completed 28 years civil service with the State Department. She served alongside her husband, Larry Ikels, who was also Foreign Service officer for 31 years. They were stationed in 6 countries in South America and Europe, and at the same time, they raised 2 great sons. The focus of Judy's work was on policies for employees' well-being and in support of the Foreign Service families. She managed a broad portfolio, developing policies and implementing programs in a wide range of areas. As we all know, a diplomat, when you send overseas, there are a lot of things have to be taken care of. And you travel from country to country throughout the career. The spouse often have to give up the career or rearrange the work. And the children's education and the well-being must be taken care of. And there are plenty of emergencies to be dealt with as well. She's skillfully addressed those issues so the diplomats can focus on their main mission. So in 2019, she was honored with the Director General of the Foreign Service Cup, which is a high honor, and given each year only to one civil service employee for devotion to duty, outstanding leadership, creative innovation, and tireless pursuit towards what is right. In 2017, she also received the Champion of Career Enhancement Award from the Associates of the American Service Worldwide for her tireless work and support of Foreign Service family members and their employment. Judy's story about her father and her search for him was first published as a memoir in the State Department's official journal. And this book is just the beginning of her writing projects. In a way, this is her father's gift and blessing to her. She said during her interview, "It is never too late to pursue something you feel important and passionate about." I think many of us feel the same. Okay, floor is yours, Judy.
Thank you. Want to say something? No. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to be here with all of you. It's Sunday afternoon. You could be doing a lot of different things. You could be watching football. You could be doing a million things, but you decided to come here and spend it with us. And I'm very, very grateful. I'm so grateful to Chaling and others that I have met recently. Gary for spending an afternoon, Lunming for doing a lot of work with us, translating and to explore this story. And I'm just very grateful. There is no group of people that has been more receptive to this book project of mine than the Chinese American community here in this area. So I am truly grateful. So what I want to do is just, I think everyone knows this a lot about the history of World War II, much more than I do. I have commented before that when I was in high school, World War II was still pretty close in the history books. It was just a little, maybe one chapter at the end of the book. And so often we would get to that and then the semester would be over. I never really felt like I studied World War II. And on top of that, I was a little bit mad about it because that war took my father. And I was never particular, and I didn't like the idea of war anyway. And as I was growing up, we were getting into the middle of the Vietnam War, which I was taking friends of mine, and I just didn't like the idea of it. But I had a really amazing thing happen in my life. I hope everyone in their life has something happen to them like I did. A big surprise. So let me tell you all about it. And I want to thank Leo and Gary and Lee for helping set up this this setup here, I could never have done this myself in a million years. Okay, so we want to move down.
Let me see.
This is why we have technical support.
Judy prefers this way.
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce you to my father, Second Lieutenant William H. Wallace, Jr. There he is. He was born on August the 23rd in 1918, and he died on June 10th in this incident that I will tell you about in 1944. Coincidentally, our son, David, was born on August the 23rd. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. Bill and my mother got married in August the 1st, 1940, no, excuse me, 1941. And as you remember, on December the 7th of that year was Pearl Harbor. So they had only been married a couple of months when the war broke out. And right away, he decided to enlist, as many young Americans did at the time. There was a massive enlistment. And my father decided that he wanted to train to be a pilot. And that required a little bit longer period of training. So very shortly after my mother and father got married, they had already moved into a nice little apartment, and they were, expecting to be there. They both had good jobs. But he took off on this training mission. And I can't explain the gap between 42 and 43. I don't know why he wasn't involved sooner, but he had already enlisted. The enlistment papers show him enlisting earlier. And then he went all over the United States to train to be a pilot, but there were different parts of the training that were happening at different bases. So he went first to this Air Force training in San Antonio, so he stayed within the state. And then he went to Boise, Idaho, and then to Wendover Field in Utah. And then in January of 1944, he was in Nevada. A lot of news about Nevada these days, to learn the bombing aspect. And finally, his name appeared on a list at the Army base in Langley Field, Virginia, which is very near Newport News. And coincidentally, my youngest grandson is in school at Newport News right now. So we've come full circle. What just amazed me when I read about it is how many people lost their lives in this training. I imagine the same thing happened in China. I don't know, but at least 15,000, and they were all at the time men, died in training before they ever left the United States to go to the war. This is just an unimaginable number to me of sacrifice. And it was because the planes were new, the technology was new, and they were rushing to try to get as many planes in the air as they could, not only for China and the South Pacific, but also for Europe. There were some 18,000 B-24s developed that I've learned our fathers both flew this airplane. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So that was his experience. And then, of course, the incident that happened in China that took his life was he was a bomber pilot. Now, in the beginning of the war, it was the Flying Tigers were generally solo pilots. They went out on missions and they were fighting plane to plane, man to man against the Japanese Zero flyers. But eventually the United States and China realized that they could make a really big impact on the war if they concentrated on shipping, Japanese shipping. So my father was stationed in Kunming, And his mission was to fly up to the Yangtze River, longest river in the world inside one geographic region. You know that. You probably studied all that in school. But the Japanese, as you know, had been coming in and robbing things from the Chinese. Everything from minerals and, to fuel their industrialization. Not only that, but food. And so shipping on the Yangtze River and at those ports was a prime target. And that was my father's mission. And the night he died, he left with 7 men on board, 9 500-pound bombs, headed up to the river. And they flew for 11 hours. They found some targets. They dropped some bombs. They flew near a Japanese air base that let loose some ammunition in front of the plane, which caused my father to pull the plane down close to the river and keep going like that. All of this was in the military records that we found. And so after 11 hours of flying, they came back we were supposed to land back at the base at Guilin. But I don't know what happened. They didn't plan. The whole thing was a mess that night. There were too many airplanes in the sky. And there were Japanese airplanes in the sky. And Bill could not get a homing on the airstrip. He couldn't land the plane because the radar, they would turn the radar on for like 3 minutes and then turn it off. Turn it on for 2 minutes and then turn it off. It was impossible for him to get the radar to land the plane. And so finally, the radio tower told him to fly to Kunming, which was 2 hours away. Now, he didn't have 2 hours worth of gasoline in the plane. They'd been out for 11 hours. He knew there wasn't enough gas to make it, but those were his directions. So they started offloading everything they could from the plane, the bomb hoist, the undetonated bombs, flak jackets, anything they could get, anything they could throw off that plane, they let it go. But it still wasn't enough. And short of landing in Kunming, my father commanded that his crew of 7, the navigator, the bombardier, the wiggly armed gunners, all should jump, parachute out. And they stood along that narrow 9-inch runway that was between the cockpit and the back of the plane. And one by one, they jumped. The engines were going out. First, it was a 4-engine plane. When it got down to just 1 engine and then went silent, my father was still on the plane. As the pilot, he was the last one on the plane. But when he jumped, either the plane was too low, or the mountain was too high, or perhaps he collided with something in his jump and he did not survive that jump. So his body fell near Kunming, and one by one, all of the other airmen came out of the mountains, walking down to a little village, which later was identified as Peilang or Peiling. But they couldn't find the pilot. The pilot was not walking out. And so the crewmen went back to base, and the villagers sent 2 young men, 2 Chinese villagers, up to the mountain to look for him. Someone had seen that last parachute falling. And they found his body and they stayed with it for 2 days, in spite of fears and superstitions about dead people. They stayed there. Those Chinese villagers, 2 young men, we don't have their names, they stayed there so as no harm would come to his body. 2 days later, the army sent in horses to go up the mountain to bring him down. And he was buried in China. They had a military burial for him there. You see his name on it. And that is where his body rested until 1947, when by then the war was over and it was possible to fly deceased soldiers back to the United States. Before that, they didn't have, Gary mentioned flying the hump. You are all familiar with that part of the story. In order to supply those airmen in southern China, they had to fly all the way to India to get every spark plug, every uniform, every gallon of gasoline had to come over the hump. Well, not really over, it was more like through the Himalayas with Mount Everest at the end of it. Horrible weather, worst weather in the world. They had to fly through there. So logically, they were not, the military was not going to risk people's lives to fly deceased soldiers home until they could do so coming back over the Pacific. And in 1947, our family, well, of course, I was a baby, but our family was notified and asked, where do you want to have his remains sent? And my family chose to have his remains sent to Arlington National Cemetery, where his remains rest today. I have some pictures of that too. So, people, 70 years went by. More than 70 years went by. I knew about my father, but I didn't talk about him too much. His parents were grief-stricken. He had no siblings. And so I knew a little bit about what had happened to him, but honestly, his mother and father couldn't talk about it. My grandparents, they couldn't talk to me about this. It was their only son who they'd lost him. But, and this is what I'm talking about, sometimes surprising things happen in life, very surprising things. I got this email and I started calling it the Eureka email. It said, "Hi, Judy. I hope you will forgive me for contacting you. I'm trying to get in touch with relatives of Ernestine Davenport Goodman, whose first husband, Second Lieutenant William Hubert Wallace Jr., was killed in World War II. We are desperate to find some images or more information about him for a memorial project." And it was signed Pat Lucas, country representative in China at the Asia Foundation. I got this out of the blue. How do you say out of the blue in Chinese? It just was a huge surprise. I didn't know Pat Lucas, so I wrote him back right away. I said, "Dear Dr. Lucas, Bill Wallace was my father. I never knew him. He died in China before I was born. I would love to learn more about your research and how you singled out Bill Wallace as a fallen soldier of interest. Kind regards, Judy Ikels." And then I started doing more research on the internet, which I could have done before, but I hadn't. I could have found this myself just by doing a little research. But I saw this photograph of this memorial, which stands about 4 feet tall. It's not small. And this is when it was dedicated in 2006. So what had happened, Pat Lucas, studying and working in China for 20 years, totally fluent in Chinese. I mean, the man is totally fluent in Chinese. He got his PhD in China in Chinese. Need I say more? Need I say more? He's a brilliant guy. But he had a special love and interest in airmen, American airmen who had served in China. And he was intrigued by Bill's story, and he was unhappy because he couldn't find any relatives. And I'll explain a little bit. You know, I had been adopted. Meantime, when I was about 8 years old, I was adopted. So my last name was not Wallace anymore. And on top of that, I had married. I was like lost. You can look for me all day as a Wallace online and you're not going to find it. So they decided, lacking a family member, they would just put up a memorial there for him. And as you can see, it says B-24 bomber pilot, a young hero who knowingly exchanged his life, redeeming 7 others. Okay, and then on the other side, it says, may Americans and Chinese forever remember the shared sacrifices of our 2 great peoples in hope of friendship and peace. This is standing someplace in China. I'm here in Washington, D.C. What the heck? So we got really busy, got very busy. The first thing we did was to get the whole family together. We had all been to Arlington Cemetery before, but we had never been there all together. Me, my husband, my son-in-law, Carlos, my daughter, Catherine, my son, David, and our 2 grandchildren, Benjamin and Samuel. We had never been there all together. And we took pictures that day and we spent the day remembering Bill. And I put that all together in a little book, a little, you know, snap, what is it called? Little photograph book. And then I got to thinking, well, if I could put this together in a little photograph book, maybe there's more to this story that I need to build on. There's more. All those people in China who still were remembering the Americans and who built a monument to my father, I better go there and thank them. That's what I thought. I better get over there as fast as I can and thank them. So I first heard from Pat Lucas in 2015. By February, it was like September. By February, Larry and I were on our way to China. We flew business class. It was wonderful. We landed in Beijing and we had a wonderful welcome in Beijing. And then very quick, we have friends at the embassy there to get adjusted to the time difference and all that. And then we flew down to Kunming. And I don't know what I was expecting. I thought maybe a couple of people might be interested to meet us. I didn't know. Oh boy, I was really wrong about that. A lot of people were interested in the daughter of a flying tiger. It could have been any daughter of any flying tiger. It wasn't just me. It could have been any of us. So we got this really nice reception. There was a big reception at the community hall in Kunming. People met us with a banner. The banner outside the building, which somehow I didn't get a photograph of. I don't know if Pat did. Said, "Welcome, Judy Ikels. To be the daughter of a hero is the highest honor." Oh, wow. That's really, somebody went to a lot of trouble here. And they did. We met the mayor. We met the president of the Poetry Society. We met the president of the Flying Tiger Society there. The Flying Tigers social group held a big banquet for us. And there's Pat Lucas on the left and his daughter, Alaya, my late husband, Larry, and 2 gentlemen who helped us possibly more than anyone else. So let me just pause to say that none of this would have happened without Pat Lucas. Pat Lucas was so determined not to let Bill's memory be lost. And and also a Chinese family, the Lee family. I'll introduce you to them in a minute. But let me just say that because Pat had been in this area several times, it took him he lived in Beijing. He would fly down there trying to find the place that Bill died. He had to get to know municipal officers, the local police, the local village, community centers. He spent so much of his goodwill to make the trip happen. It would not have happened without Pat Lucas. And, I always say, think about it. I mean, it is, after all, the People's Republic of China. Okay. I was at the time an active member of the State Department with the top secret clearance. And my husband was retired Foreign Service. Who knew what that was? I mean, everybody who worked for USIA, he's a press officer, he's a public diplomacy officer. Everybody thought that was the CIA. Well, it wasn't. But what I'm saying is that if it hadn't been for Pat Lucas, we would have never made this trip. I owe everything to him. So, and his daughter was just adorable. She just went with us everywhere. And of course, she was bilingual, which I am not in Chinese. So, and this is the area again that where the Yangtze River Basin, just as a reminder of where all this happened. There was a group of supporters, largely from the Flying Tigers Association in Kunming, that got the money together to rent us a little bus to take us to the village of King Shuitang. Thank you, Gary, for putting in the Chinese name. And there we were on the bus. Most of those young people are journalists. They went with us everywhere. And they were so sweet. They were so curious. They just wanted to talk to us all the time. There's Pat and Alaya on the bus, and up we go from Kunming. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's, right here, all the way up there. And it was in the, you're probably familiar that this part, I always tell my American audiences that this is a part of China that's called South of the Clouds. The weather is very beautiful down there. Even though it was February, there were a lot of flowers blooming. The parks were full of flowers. And we took this trip through the mountain village, right up to the edge of the village. The road stopped. That was it. There was no more. That was it. And one of our helpers, Mr. Shu, his business was a security company, and they were called the Flying Tigers. So they came with us and helped us everywhere. This is going into the village. We stopped at the community center I had gifts for them. I had gifts of books and the little book of Bill's photos and so forth. And of course, they wanted to know what our plans were for the next day, and we talked to them about that. And here's Mr. Shu. I don't know honestly whether this man spoke English or whether we just got really good at sign language, but I love this guy. He was so sweet. And he was really the day-to-day planner. He was like the itinerary, we have to be on the bus at a certain time and we have to do, like that. And I think he may have known, he might speak good English. I don't know, but he was our link along with Pat and Alaya. Then we hosted a dinner, a thank you lunch in the courtyard of the little village to thank the people of this town for helping the Americans during the war and for remembering my father. And as you can see, they gave us a slightly higher table because my husband was 6'2" and I don't know. They took compassion on us, and then we deliver. And Pat was not short either. Another 6'4", I think. Anyway, we got very accustomed to doing a tag team talks. I would say a few things, Pat would translate, or, you know, because I wanted to thank them, and that he helped me with that everywhere. It was a beautiful outdoor lunch. It was 40 degrees. It was cold. The flowers are blooming, but it was cold. And here is our hostess, I called her Mrs. Lee, with her grandson. And from the village center, we walked out to their house, a beautiful farmhouse, 2-story farmhouse. We went through these big red gates. That was the little grandson. He was the one person who did not need any translation. We thought he was adorable. He laughed, and Alaya had fun playing with him. For my American audiences, I have to show them that these Chinese farmhouses have many times the animals live downstairs. And that was very unique to me. And then after we'd had a little refreshments there, it was time to walk to the memorial, the thing we had come to see. And there it is. And we laid flowers. You can see that we picked up some school children along the way. They were curious about these, you know, Americans, foreigners walking around in the fields. And I gave some remarks, and Pat translated them for me. Let me just read, after all, this is a book. So it's on page 139, if you have it. Standing on that mountainside in southern China, we discovered kind, empathetic people to connect with over shared history and values. We met families who had tilled the land, raised children, and survived the war and hardship. Largely unnoticed by outsiders. These strong ethnic Yi people living south of the clouds in Yunnan province remember American servicemen with gratitude and honor. I found a small space where an American daughter could wander into the crowd of strangers, seeking memories of her father and feel welcome. The sun was getting low in the sky. Finally, it was time to return to the village. I kissed Bill's name on that cold stone and thanked everyone again for coming with us. As we turned to climb the steep field that we had descended, a spot adjacent to the memorial stone, someone set off a string of loud fireworks, as if to say, here we are. We made it here to honor Bill. What a nice Chinese tradition. It was a day for memories, flowers, and fireworks. So, there we were. The journalists taking notes, asking questions. It was so nice. Now, the gentleman who has his hand on the memorial with me is, I called him Mr. Lee. His family, I think, had also served in the war. I'm not entirely clear about that. But he himself had served in the Chinese army, not in World War II, obviously he's too young, but later. And so he gave a little talk about using his own association, having been in the military, to relate to the story. And the Lee family, I have to say here, they had taken such an interest in Bill's history that they decided to adopt him into their family. And they gave him a Chinese name. They named him Li for the family name, Shu for the generational name, and Hua for the sound of Wallace And also, I later learned that that also means China. Is that right? Yes. Yeah. Li Shu Hua. So he had a Chinese name. They were serious about this. Do I go next? Go one more?
Yeah.
They're relaying.
Next.
Maybe the next one. There are the fireworks. Can you hear them? I don't know. We have it. We have his name written down. We'll get to it here in a minute. But you know, when I asked Pat Lucas, I said, "What should I take to the Lee family?" He said, "Please bring baby photos of Bill." He said, "If he's going to be part of their family in their pantheon of Chinese, you know, the ancestors, they need baby pictures of him to remember what he looked like." So that's what I did. Can you imagine that? That's so sweet. So sweet. So we walked back to the house, and we were going to have dinner at the Lee farmhouse that night. And I walked into the kitchen because, like a fool, I thought I could help. No, by then there were other people there, more neighbors. I don't know. It was kitchen was very crowded. But who was having the best time was this little boy, because they used corn cobs to fuel that oven. And he was throwing them in there, and the sparks would fly, and he would laugh. He was having the best time in there. And he clearly knew how to do it. He had done it before. This was not a new task for him. And we had so much good food. Most of the produce came from their farm and nearby. The next morning, Larry and I had wanted to give gifts to the school. We had thought about perhaps buying a computer or something for them. But we learned that all of the children in the village had been assigned to go to, there had been a little redistricting, I guess, and they were in another school. So we just asked if we could meet with the children in the community and give them each a monetary gift to buy something along the lines of a new backpack or an umbrella or something that they might need. And these sweet children waited for us in the rain that morning for us to get down to the community center. And there was the lovely young boy, I think he was about 15 years old, who had written a speech for us, which he gave, and then Pat Lucas translated for us into English. It was so sweet. All righty. After we left the village, we had some other memorable experiences, and all because Pat was, had put his thinking cap on for us. You know this because you know the history, that during the war, when the Flying Tigers started their work in South China, there were no airstrips. The airstrips had to be built, and they were built out of limestone, crushed limestone. And the rocks would be brought in, and legions of Japanese men, women, and children crushed the rocks right on the spot to make gravel runways. You know that, don't you? Yeah. And so Pat Lucas managed to find two old gentlemen, and they must have been in their late 80s or early 90s, for us to meet with. They didn't speak Mandarin, they spoke a local dialect. And so we had to have two sets of translations. And, but they were youngsters, and that helped build those airstrips. And I asked them, I said, "What do you remember about that time?" And they said, "We remember the hard work. We remember the Americans being here, that we got paid for the first time, and we had plenty to eat, mainly meat." And that really made an impression on me. They had not forgotten. And they kept saying to me, "Thank you for your father's service." This is something no American had ever said to me like that. So I really appreciated it. I gave them little flag pins with the American and Chinese flags, put it on there. They looked like they had just stepped out of a history book, these long beards. so forth. I really wanted to hug them, but I didn't, because I had kind of gotten the idea that American women hugging, yeah, no, it's just a step too far. A step too far. So there we were. And we went to the Flying Tigers Museum, which is in Kunming. A whole wing of that museum is dedicated to the Flying Tigers. And I signed the guest book. And then we went to a park where airmen might have gone on rare days of leave. I tried out the exercise equipment. It was so fun. And then we saw that beautiful outdoor dancing that happens all over China. Do you all do that here? Do you do? No, it's so beautiful. And then we went to the home of one of our hosts to try to make Chinese dumplings. And in the back of the book, you will see I have a recipe for Chinese dumplings. Now, the first ones that I did looked terrible. Terrible, but we finally got the hang of it. And then we got together. This was a group, again, of the benefactors of this trip. Larry and I hosted a dinner for them before we left Kunming. Unless you think we didn't do anything else but just go see the memorial, we did a lot of tourism. We stood on the Great Wall of China, which on what must have been the windiest day in history. And I write about this in the book because I have lived in other places with the Foreign Service, ancient civilizations. Primarily, I think of Mexico, Colombia, and Greece are three places that I lived where the ancient part of the civilization is still very prominent in the daily lives of the people there. And you can visit, in Mexico City, you can go down to the Zócalo and you can see the excavations there of those ancient temples that were built before the time of Christ. I've lived in places where these ancient monuments still exist, and it made me feel, it just gave me a new perspective. When I went to China, I'd never been there before. So China is very modern. It has everything. All up in the village, everybody up there has a cell phone. You know that. But at the same time, it has this ancient undergirding that makes it so interesting. It was really fascinating to me. And then here's this guy we met in the parking lot. I hadn't thought about the fact that camels were very prominent in transportation on the Silk Road and everywhere in Asia. I didn't get on that camel. No, but we talked. We talked. And Larry and I did a lot of visiting around Beijing. We went out to see the warriors. And, have you seen the Terracotta Warriors? Yeah. Well, what's interesting about the Terracotta Warriors is that each one is an individual. They have individual hairdos. Their uniforms are not so uniform, shall we say. They have individual noses. And it really made me think, and I wrote in my book, you can have an army, yeah, but every one of them is an individual, just like your father in the war and my father in the war. These are individuals that made these things happen. And somehow looking at these Terracotta Warriors, it really came home to me. So, a little philosophy along the way. When I got home from China, I really had to do some digging. Keep in mind, I had 6 overseas assignments. We had packed up and more moves than that. But I knew somewhere in all of that storage, I had artifacts from my father. And I went on a big search and I found letters from my father to my mother and from my mother to my father, a lot of stuff. And that's what I used to put this book together. You can see these letters. It's handwritten on there, deceased. And that's how they came back to my mother. And it must have been heartbreaking for her. And they had not been opened. She never opened them again. The letters she sent to Bill, she never opened them again. But I did. And that's how I learned a lot. We have other artifacts, you know, his Purple Heart, a little Bible that his mother gave him, and so forth. And so I started collecting books about the history. I did a lot of reading. I organized my files. I realized that even if I only had one slip of paper that said birth certificate, I needed to have a folder for it, because I was riffling through all these really old documents, and I thought, I can't keep handling them like this. They're going to fall apart. So those were my files. There's a portrait of Bill as a young boy, already in a uniform, as a Boy Scout, and with his mother and father on the right. His high school graduation photo. By the way, Bill, my mother's sister, her husband, my stepfather, my adopted father, and I all graduated from the same high school. Wow. I had my mother's senior English teacher as my senior English teacher. And my mother studied Latin, and she was a much better student than I was. And Eula Pearl Smith never let me forget it. Yes. Bill is there with his friends. He worked at Sun Oil Company in Dallas. There are very few pictures from the wedding. I do have Mother's wedding dress. I keep thinking, what should I do with that? She was very popular girl, Ernestine Davenport. She had lots of boyfriends. I know, because I have seen some of the letters. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. She broke some hearts along the way, but she finally decided to marry Bill. Now, interestingly, when he was going around, remember the first slide I showed you, all those places that he traveled to train? Mother went with him. It's very unusual. Most of the women, wives, could not stay on the air bases. They couldn't live in base housing. But 2 or 3 couples would get together and rent a house near the base. And the women would be there during the week. And then the flyers, or as they call them, the fly boys, would come home on the weekends. And I can only imagine what a great time they had. They must have had fabulous parties, and I don't know. And this was his graduating class from when he got his wings. And that was his crew. Bill is the second from the left on the bottom. Not all of those men were on the plane that night, but in the collection of letters, I have letters that 2 or 3 of them sent to my mother after Bill died. There's that famous B-24 Liberator low altitude bomber. Oh boy, what a plane. You know, I'll just tell you something funny. When I was working on this book, I had someone who was helping me do the book design. And the first picture they sent to me had a gorgeous aircraft on it, but it wasn't a B-24. She said, but it's so pretty. The plane is so pretty. I said, it doesn't matter. It's not a B-24. But we got over that. So listen, I got into a B-24. There is a group called the Collings Foundation, and they keep up old aircraft. That's their job. I mean, not their job. I mean, it's a nonprofit organization. I'm not sure they're flying anymore, but in 2016, they were still flying, and there was still an airworthy B-24, and it flew into Altoona, Pennsylvania, which is not that far. We drove up there. That whole crew that you saw, my family, all of us, we went up there, and we all got on a B-24. And I felt like, I don't know, I can't tell you how good that felt to me. And we met the pilot. he told us a little bit about flying. That's the cockpit. I thought, my gosh, my father was 25. He probably only recently had learned to drive a car. And then he learned to fly this. It's something, isn't it? So that's the only picture. There are a lot of pictures of me naturally, but this is the only picture I could find of this little gray Chevy. That's the little gray Chevy that my mother drove all over the United States following Bill. And he wrote her a letter from China saying, sometimes I look down the road and I wish I could see that little gray Chevy. So yeah, mother, you know, it was just me and mom for a while. But I don't want you to think I never had a father, because I did. My mother remarried in 1947. A wonderful guy. I should have a picture of him. He was in the Navy, and he loved children. He loved children, and he was willing to marry my mother, even though she had a little girl. And he was a wonderful father to me. And as it turned out, mother and Sandlin never had any children of their own. So in one of those historic twists of fate, if I hadn't had him, I would have never had a father. And without me, he would have never had a daughter or a child. So I say that worked out pretty well. That worked out pretty well. Now, what else have we got here? I'm not even looking at time. Oh, there's my friend. Look, you know him? John J.C. Wang did the calligraphy for this book. And I met him through Chaling and Maryland. And, you know, one thing led to another there. And he invited me to his studio when he heard about the story. And he did this beautiful calligraphy that's in the book. And I don't know if you've been in his studio, but it's really something. It's really the smell of the ink, you know, and the sound of rice paper. I mean, it's really amazing. This calligraphy is one he did. This does not appear in the book. And actually, I should say it says, Father, hero, always remember. But you know that because you can look at it. And his seal up here, he makes these seals. And anyway, he did 2 or 3 for me. And this, the one that's in the book is the one we chose. I have it framed in a beautiful red lacquer frame. Yes.
This is one of the calligraphy.
Yes.
Different from here.
Different, yeah.
Why eventually you decided to pick this one, not that?
Because
they're slightly different.
They are slightly different. And I chose this one because it most closely resembles the words on the monument in China. I think it most never forgotten is a little bit closer.
You knew that. You knew that.
So, and I wanted to use the one that read right to left. This one reads top to bottom. I thought that's too easy. No, it needs to be like the Chinese. Yeah, that's why I chose that. Okay, there he is in his dress uniform, his dress flight gear. Isn't he cute?
Yes.
Isn't he adorable?
Yes.
Now, there I am in my house. This is in my office. I wouldn't dare show you a picture of the rest of the office. It's a mess. This part is pretty good. And I was so thrilled when I was writing this book to learn that 2022 is the year of the tiger.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I learned that, and I got Chinese decorations that say year of the tiger, and I have them all over my house, in the living room, on the front door, and in my office. I'm never taking that down. Next year is the year of the rabbit. Who cares? So that's my story. Thank you very much.
the wonderful touching talk. Thank you so much, Judy. And I'm sure we will have a lot of questions from our audience. 我们现在就提问啊，直接跟Judy 提问，有没有问题？好，李冰。
Judy, thank you for this very touching story. I have a question. When Dr. Lucas contacted others,
by the time Dr. Lucas, it's a good question. By the time Dr. Lucas communicated with me, everyone that knew Bill was gone. That is so sad. I am so sorry about that. And since he had been looking for me for 10 years, who would have still been living would have been my aunt and uncle. You'll read about them a little bit in the book. They knew Bill. They were in the same. My uncle Roy was a pilot for Pan American Airways, and he and Bill were in the same Boy Scout troop and in the same famous high school that I mentioned. But my mother did not live to know the story. Neither did his parents. I'm so sorry about that.
I was thinking, who else could put in more into your story, right? Your mother.
Mm-hmm. I have a little project. My grandfather Wallace had one brother, and I have been looking for his children in Texas, but I haven't found them yet. Now, I've been kind of busy, but I'm going to get into Ancestry and see if I can't locate them, because I think they would enjoy knowing about this story. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that part. How did the Lucas find you?
So he found me because he was astute. He saw Bill's name in my mother's obituary. When my mother passed away in 1998, I wrote her obituary, and I debated about whether or not to include her first marriage. Why? Because Mother and Daddy had moved from Texas to Oklahoma. And I don't think they ever told anyone there. In fact, I'm sure they hadn't told anyone that she had been a war widow, or never mind where I came from. They didn't talk about it. I don't know why, but I knew that, and I debated, and I put Bill's name in that obituary. And when when Pat Lucas saw her name and my name in the same obituary, he contacted me on LinkedIn. Don't take your names off LinkedIn. It's annoying. And Facebook, they're annoying, but somebody important might find you.
But you didn't have the same name.
No.
But how did he?
There's another piece. Thank you. Because during the 1990s, women started using their maiden names as the middle name. You know, it's very chic. Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Okay.
Whatever. So because my birth name is Judy Lynn Wallace, which changed to Judy Lynn Goodman, which changed to Judy Lynn Ikels. And then I put that Lynn aside and started using Goodman. And I also did it to honor my adopted father. When I started using my name professionally, when I got business cards, I wanted that Goodman in there.
Oh, okay. He's a good man.
He was a good man. He was adorable. Mother had only the handsomest people around her. It's amazing. Yeah.
Do you have any chance to meet other crew members of the same plane?
The short answer is no. Pat Lucas, who started doing this research long ago, 10, 15 years ago now, he contacted, I think, he met with one, he might have met with two surviving crewmen. But it was not, it wasn't what he was hoping for. They talked a little bit, but many people from World War II did not want to talk about their experiences. Pat flew to the United States to interview them. And I have always wanted to see any of that video footage, but I haven't seen it. And those people are gone now too. Yeah. I had one other thought floating around in there. I'll come back to it, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Questions?
Yeah.
Pat did a lot of research. That's how you found your father, and online, also your book, and online to see what he was doing. And he also found some of the other lost flight tigers. So where does he keep all his information? It's trouble. Treasure. So people know how it's lost.
Charlie, I think his website is where he is putting everything. His website is called Remembering Shared Honor, and it's in the book. I refer to it in the book. And Pat moved back to Oregon about 3 years ago, and I'm not entirely sure why. And we do communicate, but he is not the world's fastest communicator now. I think he's busy with other things, and he was very happy with the book. I sent him the manuscript because I wanted him to check it. I wanted to be sure I had the story okay for him. And then when the book was published, of course, I sent him copies. And he wrote back and he said, it's gorgeous. And that made me very happy. But, I don't know entirely. He and his wife have together 4 daughters. They have two daughters of their own and 2 adopted Chinese daughters, Alaya being one of them. And I think 3 of those girls are in college right now. I figure he's probably working his head off to just get those girls through college. That's speaking from personal experience about putting kids through school. Yeah.
So question, during the course of your research, do you by chance know where the boy was sent to China through U.S. military or through some kind of volunteer organizations?
I know that in the beginning, the initial Flying Tigers were part of the AVG, the American Volunteer Group. But by the time he got there, they were transferring that into the 14th Army. And, we didn't have an Air Force to begin with. It was part of the Army. And he was part of that transition. And it didn't fully, the Air Force was founded in 1947. So he was in that interim group. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know how many Flying Tigers are buried in Arlington?
No, I don't. That'd be a good question.
Now, where's your father's cemetery in Arlington? The location of that?
I could find out, but I know just how to walk there by, but it has a number.
Yeah, a group of us were actually thinking to pay respect to your fathers in Arlington before the start. We didn't know
where to go. Oh, yeah, well, that can be arranged.
Give us a map.
I will. Let's all go together and then have lunch.
Sure.
Yeah, it has a number and it has a location, and sometimes I have to kind of find my way. And then, the scenery changes a little bit. I always used to recognize it by a certain setting of trees. And then I went one year and one of those was gone. And, you have to keep looking. I am wondering, the last time I was at Arlington, I noticed that some of the graves nearby had been replaced, the gravestones. And I'm going to ask Arlington if that's something that the cemetery does or if that's something that the family does. And if we get to the, you know, if they say, oh, that's, you can do that, you can pay for that, and I will do that, and then I'll invite people to that event. If we have it, that's still a lot of ifs, if. But I have that in the back of my mind. Also, I put his name, you've been out to Udvar-Hazy, the airplane museum out in Dulles. They have these things called walls of honor, a wall of honor, and I have inscribed Bill's name there. So you can find William H. Wallace Jr. by looking on the list, and then it gives a number and so forth. Because, well, first of all, I wanted to do it, but I do think that those guys were early innovators. They were flying planes. I mean, it would be like now people driving a Tesla, you know, it was new. All that engineering and all of that was brand new. It's the reason they had so many accidents. So yeah, I think it's good that his name is there. Makes me happy. Yeah.
Just wonder the culture back in the 1940s. When did you remember you were someone without father died, and your mother may have mentioned that earlier and convey messages about your father, or she doesn't want to talk about it, or your stepfather doesn't want to know things like those. I just wonder, you mentioned that you were adopted, and you mentioned write something, mother died, debated whether you bring up the situation. I mean, that may impact how soon you may have found this story, or the way that you find it.
Yeah. So I knew very early on, and I knew because my name was different. But little children, I don't know when children begin to really understand about death. I wrote when you get to the end of the book, I have some poetry and recipes. One of my friends said this is like dessert at the end of the book. But anyway, one of those poems addresses this in a way, because you don't understand when you're really, really little what that means. I hadn't even had a pet that died. I didn't understand what death meant. And I would go to church, you know, and we would pray to our Heavenly Father. I thought, well, maybe that's Bill. I don't know. You have these stupid ideas when you're a child that you just don't know. I remember it was in 1952. How old was I? 44 to 6 or something. Or yeah. When I finally had a full picture. Because the other thing is that you don't understand entirely where babies come from. I mean, you don't know. It's like when you're little, you just don't get any of that. And I had a mother and a father, and I had all these grandparents, but I did have 3 sets of grandparents. I was the most spoiled. Anyway, yeah. And so it isn't that it isn't that they didn't want to talk about it. I would say it was more that life just moved on for people. And my Wallace grandparents, I knew them very well. I never had a babysitter when I was a little girl. I would stay with the Wallace grandparents, with the Davenports, with the Goodmans. I always had a place to go. I was the only resident grandchild. There were some other grandchildren, but they were in California. They would come to visit in the summer. There was a lot of fun when my cousins would come, but I was the only one there. So, and people used to love it at school when we had school programs. They always wanted me to be in the program somewhere, because by definition, I would bring 6 audience members with me, you know, right off the bat, because all my grandparents came to everything. And I would say that I really have to give my mother credit. She was very resilient, a very resilient person. And also my adopted father, because he seamlessly integrated Bill's mother and father into our family. Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthdays, whatever. They were always there. And Sandlin was very loving with them. So, you know, I mean, war does terrible things to families, but it also gives you an opportunity to kind of mend things back together. Yeah.
When you went to the mountains and meet those people and their ancestry or their grandparents who found your father, did they say how did they get in touch with the authority? Because people came very quickly, 2 days, and came to get your father's body. And 7 crew members, they dropped at the different villages. And
yes.
I read from book, they are picked up here and there very quickly, like the next day went to the base. How is the system organized that they can be found that quickly?
That's a good question. I never thought about it exactly like that.
But it's organized or just spontaneous? And...
I'm guessing here that the crew members that survived told their officers, and those officers worked with the local people to get in there.
And that's everywhere in the mountains.
I know. You know, they say that one of the main things that the Americans brought was communication, the helping with more advanced communication than had existed. So they may have had radio contact somehow. I really don't know. It's a good question. I could ask Pat.
And they have that patch.
Yeah, that thing is called a blood chit. Why was it called that? I've never understood that. You know what I'm talking about? They would sew that a silk patch in the back of the flight jacket that said in Chinese, you know, this is an American flyer, please take care of them, and so forth. And there are samples of that in that museum where I visited. And there's a picture of Bill in that museum. You know, I had no idea that stuff was there. Yeah.
Thank you, Judy, for sharing stories with us. Because I'm very glad to do this because I'm from that area.
Are you?
My hometown is in Kunming. I grew up there, and so a lot of the pictures you showed that they are very familiar to me. The villages, the look of the people, and even you see that the picture of see the seagulls there, right?
Yes.
You have that, yeah, that's a scene in spring in Kunming. They migrate from Siberia, stay over the winter there.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah, that's a beautiful park.
Yeah.
So pretty.
Yeah. Actually, in my life, I read a lot of books and heard the stories from my relatives, from my grandpa. I think my grandpa was born in 1921, very close to where the angel built. And he told me that back in the 40s, in even small villages, in small towns in China, in that, and they see that American soldiers, they set up radar stations over the mountain. And actually in Yunnan, it is an underdeveloped area in China. Usually there is only the airports in the capital city of the province. But during that period of time in Yunnan province, there are a lot of airports in small towns. I heard that you see the airstrips, right? People are building that out of very hot labor.
Yeah, labor.
They use buffaloes, use horses, donkeys to crash limestones.
Yeah.
And they told me a lot of stories about it.
Talking about the airstrips reminds me that we visited one. I can't say the name of it. It's in the book. You'll read about it in the book. Some of the airstrips have been turned into apartment houses and you know, shopping malls and so forth. But there one has been kept as a historical what did you say? Oh, just that as a memory. And we went there, and I wondered if that was the airstrip he was trying to get to that night. And it, you know, you can still see it it was a big sacrifice for Chinese villagers to give up what was probably rice farming land, flat. The only flat place for rice farming, and they gave it up for these airstrips. That must have been horrible to have to do. But then, and also we saw there still had these things called revetments. I wrote about that in the book too. A revetment is like a dirt wall that's built around, and the planes would back into them or drive into them to park to mitigate damage from nearby bombing. Well, I don't know. It didn't have a roof. It was just a dirt wall. Has anybody seen those? And that airstrip still has them. And they were, it was really interesting to walk in there and see that. Oh, covered with wildflowers now, But I was standing there thinking, well, Bill didn't make it here that night. Wonder what he would think about me making it here. This is really a moment. We had a moment at that airstrip. So yeah.
Two pictures.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Trying to search for that.
Searching for the best.
I was trying, but now let's see.
It's called a blood chip. I have no idea.
A lot of time behind.
Yeah, I used to see them online, but not this time around. 华阳一体, okay.
I don't know if Bill's clothing had that on it. That didn't come home. Mother had sent him some food, some cans of fruit and chocolate. And that was part of the communication after he died. The co-pilot asked if he could have that food, and she said, of course.
Oh, okay. Try this. Oh,
来华抗战。
来华抗战。
抗日洋人。抗日洋人。
抗日洋人。
I have a T-shirt with that on back in 2015. I bought it.
Oh, really?
Memorial for 70th anniversary.
For the anniversary, yeah.
Right.
We have another big anniversary coming up in 25.
Oh, right here.
Here
we go. That's the one.
That's the back of jacket.
Yeah.
Yeah.
军民一体救护.
That's for the local
That's
villages.
for the rescue
so they can
purpose.
identify
The rescue purpose.
the heroes.
But Chinese people don't really need this to recognize because it's not the Japanese love. It's the Western face. It's sufficient. It's enough.
Yeah. In case you want to read the book, and Judy brings the book here, and she can also sign for those books.
Yeah.
Julie, you mentioned you had this family treasure trove that contains the letters from your mother, from my father, and the family mementos, and also some other stuff. And also, what else do you have over here? Heirlooms, whatever. You have been having that, right? But I guess before you received the letter from Patrick Lucas, that didn't really mean a lot to you. That's something. How did you regard that? You had been having that, right?
Yeah.
Did you study that? Did you open the letter? Did you review them? Did you? I mean, what's the difference? Before you received this letter from Patrick Lucas, that treasure trove has been with you, right? Passed up from your mother, I guess. But you didn't really study that. You want to leave that a little bit behind.
No, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with it.
Did that mean anything to you then?
Yes, it was important to me that she had kept those things for me because, and I had looked probably when I was in my 30s, I had read some of the letters. So I did know that they were there, and I knew the story sort of. There was a an article in the Dallas Morning News that recorded his death. And it said something about where he died. But I had never explored that any further. I didn't, keeping in mind that back then, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have, you know, all these tools to look up. If you wanted to go get something from the Library of Congress, you had to drive downtown and, you know. And so I was interested in the story, obviously, because it's my story, but I didn't know what to do with it. And I didn't know anybody else would be interested in it. I didn't know that anybody else would be interested in this story.
But you opened the letter.
But,
you opened the letter.
Yes,
you read them.
Yeah.
It was an email.
Yeah.
But,
and then
you didn't know. You didn't really know what that really.
No, I hadn't studied the history. I hadn't studied the history of the war. Like I said, I was kind of turned off by war, you know.
Oh, okay.
I was the Peace Corps generation, you know, and I was losing friends to the Vietnam War from school. Some of my school friends died in Vietnam, and it was just like anything that had to do with war. It was like I didn't want to deal with it. Didn't want to think about it. And war had taken my father. But when I learned that there's a whole Chinese community that was so interested in his story, and that this American researcher had really knocked himself out to put the pieces together, then, and I have to admit, I felt guilty. I felt guilty that I hadn't done more research, but I got very busy. I got very busy.
Thank you.
I mean, things just happen in your life and you just can't. I mean, how could I not write a book about this story? I had to. I've never written a book before. I work for the government. I wrote talking points memos, speeches. I did a lot of training. I can do a budget report, just like that. I had never written long form, book form.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I missed it. My question, when did you know Bill is your birth father?
I knew it early on. I mean, I knew it early. Yeah, I knew it early.
So the family is open about this.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
Oh, yeah. It was just sad. It was just sad. It was just a sad story. And of course, my job as a little girl was to make everybody feel better. You know, that's what little girls do. Little girls make you laugh. It wasn't my job to bring up sad things. This wasn't my job. So, yeah.
When your father died, you know if it was aware that his wife is pregnant and you know, child of this.
Oh, yes. This is a good part of the story. This is the love story. He knew. And my mother knew that he knew. And that was something that I was very intent on putting together with the letters. I could see that the news of her pregnancy had reached him, and that the fact that he knew that had reached her. And I write about this in the book because, see, can I put my finger on? Well, it's like, okay, so today, my children of my contemporaries, they have to have a house. The school bills have to be paid, everything before they can have children. And thank goodness, my parents made a different decision. They made a decision that they wanted to have a child. This was the plan. She was going to get pregnant. She was going to come home, have the baby, and then he was going to come home, and they were going to have more children and live in Oak Cliff and send their children to Sunset High School. That was the plan. Didn't happen. But yes, they were actively trying to get pregnant when he left China. And he knew and she knew. That was a great consolation to me. Only thing is, he thought he was going to have a boy. He wrote to my mother. He said, I think there's plenty of room in a B-24 to put a little Mongolian pony in there for my son. I have that letter. I didn't put it in the book. I thought that was a little too much, but anyway, yeah, he knew. Thank you for asking that question.
So that was in the letter?
Yeah, yeah. He said he was going to get a little Mongolian pony to bring home to his son.
That makes this story so sad.
Yeah.
At the moment he was about to die, what kind of feeling you would have, right?
I thought about that a lot. I thought about that a lot. And I wrote what I thought might be his last thoughts. I worked with an editor coach, I guess you could say. And he told me one day, we were visiting and talking about the construction of the book, and I knew right away I did not want it to be chronological. I wanted it to start with the incident, start with his death, and then put it together like that. And this editor friend of mine, whose name is Roger Williams, not the musician, but anyway, he said, Judy, you have to get in that airplane and fly that last flight with your father. Mentally, you've got to get in the plane. And so part of that first chapter is me sort of thinking about that, what that must have been like. And I use the analogy of a snow globe. Sometimes when you're in a disaster, things kind of slow down in your mind. I've had that happen to me. And so that's how I dealt with that.
I just want to add that what's said is that Bill's letters keep coming to her mother, to his newlywed wife, even though after she received the death certification from the Department of Defense. So that makes things sad.
But if you want to look with me on page 7, this is how I dealt with that in the book. With all the men gone and without the roar of the engines, there was an eerie silence on board. The wind whipped through the open bomb bay as the plane fell inexorably from its gliding altitude of 7,000 feet. For a few moments, time stood still like liquid in a snow globe, as if sometimes seems to do in a crisis. Bill's body was precisely following his training as he completed the last items on his checklist, but his mind was racing far away. He saw the faces of his mother and father. He remembered writing to them that they would soon be grandparents. I hope you don't think we were foolish for not waiting, he said, because I'm sure I don't think so. Seems to me this war isn't ever going to end. And even when it does, there would probably be some other good reason for postponing things. That would be having a baby. The face of his wife came into view. In that instant, he wondered about his choice not to tell his crew that he was an expectant father. From his letter written to Ernestine a week before the fatal flight, he wrote, "Baby, I've decided not to tell the boys over here anything until later. Anything about the baby until later. In our business, it's vital that we each have absolute faith in all the others. You know how prospective fathers have a reputation for being sort of addle-headed. I certainly don't want any of my crew wondering about my decisions at a vital moment." That's a quote from a letter. That's the quote. Yeah.
Have you had a chance to share your story with other survivors, family of flying tigers or the hawk flyers?
Not really. I'm still working on that. This book was published on May 6th, and I'm just trying to get, if you have any contacts or if you know anyone that you think would be interested, please let me know, because my goal is to share the story.
I meant to come with another friend whose father was the father, and he was planning to come. And his name is Paul Friday, and father is Joseph Friday, and they he was really intent to come, but he had to go to the hospital today. Sorry, but that I am sure I'll try.
Let's make the connection and meet up. I would like for you to come to my house because I have a model B-24 there and other artifacts. I'll show you, and you can see the original calligraphy. We can do that. Yeah.
Actually, Judy, before I came today, I forwarded the story of the father to a friend of mine. Actually, she has a story. She studied in the United States, and she happens to know the daughter of General Chenault. And they get in touch, and working as Chenault assistant, they were invited to join the 2015 World War II ceremony in China. So she's working. I asked if she knows you, but she said she didn't. I think she would. She knows. I guess she knows Pat Lucas. So if you don't mind, I would connect you.
Do I mind? Please. General Chenault was such a character. He was a washed up, you probably know the story. He was a washed up flyer, half deaf from open cockpit flying, didn't have a job, went down to Florida to do an air show. And he had this trick that he would do with three planes would take off, and they would be tied together with ropes, and they'd go up and do aerial acrobatics and come and then land with the ropes still tied together. He was doing it to make money because he was broke. And Peter Mao, P.T. Mao, saw that flying exhibition and wanted him to come to China to teach flying or lead flying or whatever. And that's how General Chenault, who was also a Texan. You have to be careful when you say you're from Texas. People have odd ideas about Texas. There are a lot of good people in Texas. Lyndon Johnson, Molly Ivins, Ann Richards, Beto. So, but anyway, there are a lot of stories, and they used to have reunions. This is what I'm sorry I missed, because they used to have reunions at his memorial in Arlington Cemetery every year on one of these memorial holidays. And I missed that because I didn't know I was supposed to go. So yeah, let's do it. Yes.
Those parents or mother didn't get to know what you heard.
They did not.
They did not.
They did not.
Right. Then all your children.
My children have been so supportive. I'm just sorry that I didn't take them with me on that trip to China. It seemed like an impossible thing at the time. And I don't know whether we'll ever get back, but they've been very supportive, and they're very interested in family history. Yeah.
There will be time. You can still bring them to China.
There's still time. There is. I just don't have Pat Lucas there anymore. That's a big loss because he knew everybody.
Someone among here may think that.
Patrick Lucas was back.
Patrick Lucas is now living in Oregon.
Oh.
Oswego. Well, one of those towns in Oregon, which is where he was with the University of Oregon originally. Okay. And then he worked with the Asia Foundation, and that's why he was in China. And he did these, he sponsored through the university summer exchange programs that got American kids to China. And yeah.
Judy, I have a question.
Yes.
For the memorial stone in Qingfeitang, it was sponsored or was founded by Pat Lucas only, or is it a joint effort?
Joint. It was definitely a joint venture between some of these people I showed you that we had this party for. The head of the Flying Tigers Association in Kunming, the head of the security outfit, a taxi driver from Kunming who just got interested in the story, and he would take Pat up in the mountains. That man, he's the one who we went to his house to make dumplings. His wife was so sweet, showing us how to make dumplings. He risked his whole business because he would take Pat up into the mountains in his cab, which was his livelihood. And it's not paved up there. It's just not Montgomery County where you can drive around all over the place. No, he could have lost his vehicle and his livelihood, but he was so interested to help Pat put these pieces together. And I mean, that's part of the reason when Pat told me these stories about people who were doing all this volunteer work to try to get that, and how they got that. It's a big piece of limestone. It must weigh 1,000 pounds or more. How they got it up there, I don't know. There's no road right there. I don't know how they got it up there.
Is that the spot where they found that?
It's the spot where they found his body. Yeah.
And that's actually quite far from like the nearest town.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's quite far from Kunming. It's about a 3.5, maybe 4-hour bus trip on one of those little buses. And then I write in the book, you know, the significance of this spot. It's like I quote a Texas poet. You guys can never get away from Texas. There's a Texas poet, Sarah, I think her name is Sarah Cortez, who wrote a book of poetry called Vanishing Points. And that's what this is. It's the vanishing point. It's where he died. It's not where he's buried. It's where he died. And now, you know, we see these roadside memorials out there. Somebody gets hit by a car or a bicycle, it gets, you know, people will put flowers. And in Texas, they're quite prominent. I think it's something of a Latin American tradition to memorialize the spot, because there's this feeling like, just like you have a soft place in your heart for where you were born, the actual place where someone died, you think of their spirit leaving their body to go to heaven or whatever your belief is. And that's where this memorial is placed. People get confused about that. When I say, and it's not where he was buried in 44. That was back at the base. And I have a letter was sent out, someone I'm sure typed it up on a typewriter about what was going to happen that day, the timing and what was the appropriate dress, which included a raincoat, khakis, and so forth, that the airmen wore to go bury him in an above ground mausoleum. And all the soldiers were buried like that until they could bring them home. Yeah.
Just so happened that I went to a guided tour in Arlington Cemetery. They were talking about the gravestones. There are like a government issued gravestones. You cannot kind of like replace it. But if it's grandfathered in before a certain date, the families or the offspring could go there and just do maintenance or replacement. Probably quite hard to ask for special gravestones, but they do have a special program for memorial trees. If you have a group of people, say flying tigers if the offsprings or the families ask for certain spots to plant a memorial tree, you would get this particular tree, beautiful trees of your choice, and a plaque. And I think it probably was exploring. Yeah, I mean, if you have a tree flying tiger, I mean, I see all sorts of plaques for certain groups, Air Force, certain whatever numbers. It's very good.
Thank you for mentioning
that.
that.
Just went there before Memorial Veterans Day. Yeah, just last week.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Judy. You mentioned there were 2 villagers that found your father's remains and guarded it. And were you able to, when you went to China, were you able to identify any of the family members, descendants from that part?
When Pat Lucas was there in 2006, he met someone who had been an eyewitness. I don't know whether it was one of the young men that went to guard over his body. I don't know if it was, but he did identify him as someone who saw parachutes and then one last parachute that fell without opening. And no, I didn't.
But who told you there were 2 villagers that guarded his body?
That
person must be alive, right?
Well, someone who Pat Lucas dealt with back in 2006. Is that person still alive? I don't know.
Do you want to share my father's story a little bit?
Sure. Judy, I'm very emotional right now. The reason being that my grandfather was in the exactly same period. He was in the Air Force in 1935, and he was like when you said he flying the Han Road, flying through but he was based in Kunming, in Guilin, all bases you mentioned. He was there because he told me that. So he was trained. My grandfather was trained in the U.S. in 42 and 44, but he was in the Air Force since 1935. So he passed away 2010, so that's 12 years ago. But I was fortunately enough to spend maybe 30 years with him here. So when I hear the story, it just brings back a lot of memories back. I'm very grateful. It's just, I think, like you say, today the story somehow is not known by many people, but those American heroes helped China, and there were so many Chinese young men, and they were most of them came from very good background, family background. They joined the Air Force to fight the Japanese invaders. I remember my grandfather told me he was one of 2 Air Force cadets being accepted from Hebei province. There were only 2 people get accepted. And so it's extremely, very tough to get in. And the training was very tough too. A lot of people, like you said, I was looking after I got the invitation after I got the notice from my friend about this event. So I looked up the 50-year anniversary book from his graduation class. And there's a few pages I was looking through that. I was really so deeply moved because they were all dead young men. And there were a few sentences about each one, how they died. Like you said, most of them were died during training. I mean, there were all different kind of accidents during training, but there were many of them died during the war fighting too for one reason or another. But there were so many young men that in their 20s, 21, 22, they all died just during the training. So those were real heroes. thank you so much for your sacrifice and for your book to bring this memory to let more people know this erotic event. Really, we are being the Chinese. We are very grateful for your sacrifice for your dad.
Thank you.
Thank you. My goodness. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for your father, your grandfather. So where are we?
The end of the question and answer. Right now, the floor is yours.
It's already 4 o'clock, so
yeah,
official time. So.
We do have an appreciation. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for, finally. So we started the project back in June. So it took several months and we worked with Judy. We met with her several times. So finally she came down to speak to all of us. And we heard so many people share different stories about, like the gentleman just shared about his grandfather, and there are some other shared similar stories. So I think everyone remember the history and remember the sacrifice of the Flying Tigers, and all the young men fought the Japanese and fought the different wars. And like you mentioned, you wanted to do the talk during the veterans week. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah,
thank you. My goodness, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're really
it's our people, so appreciation. Yeah. So
Oh, look, thank you so much.
Gary, do you want to take a picture?
Oh, maybe after.
After. We'll take pictures.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really
大家要买书的话就在那然后请Judy签名。
And also we're going out for dinner. Yeah,
我们一起去餐馆。餐馆。